A lot of you know OpenChain and therefore will not be surprised by much of this talk. But this talk is about positioning, and it's especially to make sure that as people deal with an industry change, they can look at what we're doing, for instance, the recording of this talk, and understand how it connects with what they need to do next. So we're talking about how open source is changing, how it's changing from being something special and unique, difficult, mysterious, and dangerous, into something that fits much closer to traditional structures of software management. And it's somewhat inevitable. A long time ago, when open source started really trending, this is from 2012, when Dirk and Linus were young and beautiful. Dirk, I know you're going to watch this. At that time, open source was really growing and gathering all this enterprise momentum, and it was clear it would keep growing. What was really cool, some years later, now we have seasoned Dirk. Some years later, by about 2022, open source had truly taken over all open source. We had a situation where, incredibly, it had evolved into something that was just all software. And it's thanks to people like Linus and Dirk providing that continuity as it started and grew, got adoption, and then became dominant, that this happened. And the value of open source, you've probably come across these figures, is huge. Supply side is about 4.15 billion, but it's on the demand side, 8.8 trillion, that we see the utterly colossal numbers around open source, how much this stuff is valued. And that meant that open source did indeed eat software. It's absolutely everywhere. It's in everything. And that's fantastic. Open platforms for all. We're incredibly happy about that. But the lingering challenge, and it's where OpenChain has focused, it's where more and more people have to focus, is the supply chain. So the image of the supply chain of companies working on products and doing things together was that we would flow through sand all the way to a product and end up with something beautiful and nice and excellent. Of course, the reality is that things are a little bit more complex and messy than that. The supply chain is a chaotic spaghetti monster of randomness. And that has real implications. This is from 2022, where we had the open source trends from Synopsys. Over 50% of the code had compliance issues, over 80% security issues. Now, that doesn't mean open source is bad. All code has compliance and security issues. These are just data points that we can get in open source because we can look at it. And over 93% of companies, even in the industry vertical least using open source, were using open source. In many industry verticals, 100%. And inevitably, that led to a massive, obvious, simple problem. If you have issues with something like intellectual property, the person who owns that intellectual property might not love the fact that you're abusing it. And when you're in a situation where a whole supply chain is in flux, you're in a situation where intellectual property concerns will easily happen. No matter how much you want to get things right, a complex supply chain without systemic controls will have randomness. It will have problems. It will have mistakes. Harold Velte started enforcing his copyright on the NetFilter code quite a few years ago, back in 2003. And by around 2006, GPL violations had a lot of momentum in encouraging the supply chain to improve compliance, largely through cease and desist, so something tangible that could go to legal. Armine Hemmel gets a special call out. He spent a lot of time working on this, and so many companies had so many issues. So it was clear we needed to improve the supply chain. Question was, how do we do that? And naturally, the industry worked on this in various ways. SPDX from 2010 is an example, thinking of if we're dealing with the supply chain, we probably want a bill of materials. How do we do that? I was actually in the room about 2008 when what became SPDX was first raised by Rocket and Esteban from Motorola. And they said, what if we could record in a systemic way what was in software? And honestly, in 2008, the market wasn't ready for them. But by 2010, the market was ready and SPDX emerged. 2015, OpenChain emerged. Not looking at software bill of materials per se, but looking at the processes to manage stuff like that. Now, my case study is OpenChain. We're not going to stay on OpenChain too long, but I want to give you context of how and why that worked so we can get to the important point about software asset management. So the supply chain is much more than intercompany. One of our observations was that inside a company, there's an internal supply chain too. And for a big company with multiple legal entities, the supply chain just goes on and on and on forever. So ad hoc approaches to making the supply chain more trusted couldn't work. We had to have something systemic, and OpenChain was founded by a bunch of companies to get that systemic approach working. Everything was about how do we trust the open source supply chain more? How do we reduce the amount of errors, the amount of uncertainty? The current board is 25 companies. You can see them listed here, all over the world represented, many industry verticals represented. Newest member is Amazon, by the way, fantastic team. All of these companies have one thing in common, a supply chain that they need to manage. And OpenChain has approached this from the idea of process management at a high level. Not going to think about what is the format of a bill of materials that we need. Not going to think about what is the tool I will use for this, but putting in place the process points that help a company set context, and then a company can make a decision about things like formats and automation. Simple concept, ended up with 2 ISO standards. One is for security, one is for license compliance. The slides are going to be on the website, and you can also find all this material on the OpenChain website. So even though there's QR codes, I won't stay long on the slides. But suffice to say, high-level process management, defining processes, not the content of process points, and using ISO as a way to create the international baseline, one way, the baseline for things like license compliance in open source, the baseline for security assurance. And the impact across industry verticals has been substantial. We've seen every major industry vertical impacted by the work we've been doing, and a huge amount of companies turning up in our community, being part of our lists or calls or events. One example, Lockheed Martin, Chris Wood from Lockheed is the chair of our spec. And it shows a true community process. Lockheed isn't a member company, they're a community company. And we have elections to make people chair of many things like spec and education. And Lockheed is elected chair for helping develop our specs. And I think that's the kind of cool thing that shows how a genuinely open community works. As a side note, someone said to me, how do I help make your standards? And the answer was, you dial in to the calls. We're a genuine open source inspired open community. And we've seen a lot of impact. We've seen a lot of companies picking up our standards. We've done a huge amount of reference material. And we've had a lot of continuity, like companies publicly announce not only are they using our standards, but they're revalidating their certification and so on and so forth. In other words, people are using the standards to align, and then people are communicating it to their supply chain to encourage others to align. Market penetration, it's hard to tell. It's ISO standards, so anyone can use them. They don't have to tell us if they're using it. But we have had interesting data points, like PwC found 31% of large companies in Germany in their survey sample were using or planning to use our ISO standard for license compliance. Okay, case study done. For those familiar with OpenChain, don't worry, we're done with that for now. But the core thread is management. OpenChain is an example of management. People have been working on how to triage open source, how to deal with open source. OpenChain is just one example of that underway. We've seen similar initiatives triaging open source, introducing more management to it, from SPDX, Chaos, OpenSSF, To-Do Group, and others. In every area, open source has been improving how it does compliance, how it does contribution, how it does security, how it does metrics. In other words, it's been growing up. It's been getting ready and actioning how we can manage this type of software. Now, that is essentially pushing us towards very traditional software asset management. I pulled up this definition from IBM because I thought it was a nice, neat definition and slightly better than Wikipedia. But having inventories, dealing with things like how do I use this, dealing with things like intellectual property, life cycle, all of that has been there forever, ever since we started managing software. And open source has been growing to meet that, to align with it. And it's somewhat inevitable. You know, as we've dealt with the fact that open source has gone everywhere, we've had to deal with developing it on the management side just as we develop it with code. And that overlap is increasing. Just this year, for example, OpenChain released what I think is the first maturity model for dealing with open source compliance management in the supply chain. And you know, you can get maturity models from many places, but you normally have to pay for them. Or you can get maturity models, but they weren't explicitly going to help you with open source. So we were able to create with our community a maturity model and put it out under CC0, effectively public domain. And so much more. I mean, OpenChain has, and this is just OpenChain, has over 1,500 assets in its reference library, assisting with all kinds of things. Some of them are purely self-interested, like self-certification to our standards. But a lot of it fits other areas of managing open source, like, for example, having reference training around intellectual property, or having open source management courses available, free and online, having an open source policy template that allows companies to effectively build a policy for any type of approach to open source. And adjacent to that, by the way, we have example implementations in companies and projects of how to do that. Explainers to talk about this stuff to things like procurement, legal, C-suite, how to talk about it to these people, how to talk about it to your suppliers, case studies of how other companies have dealt with it. You know, one example right there is the three-way case study with BlackBerry and OSS Consultants. Russ is right there in the audience if you want to grab him and find out more. Showing how people do stuff has been a significant boost in showing, I think, that it's possible and giving people hints. We've seen areas like SBOM quality. I mean, we know there's regulations. The executive order is here in the US. We have the CRA incoming in Europe. We have regulation incoming in Japan. So we've had a telco industry work group deal with SBOM quality in detail and include automation and now third-party automation and case studies from other industries like ByteDance is using it in China. And we've done over 100 webinars explaining every aspect of software asset management. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on, you saw the trend there that OpenChain alone is doing a ton of the things you need to triage open source and bringing us closer and closer to aligning with the depth and breadth of traditional open source or traditional software asset management. We've also been addressing emerging trends. How many of you are familiar with, just by example, SPDX 3? Quite a few. Good, good, good. And in the audience, I don't know yet? No idea. If you're watching this for the first time in the recording, SPDX 3 is a major advance in how the SPDX specification works. And it changes from a software bill of materials to a system bill of materials and includes profiles for things like AI. In other words, moving into the future asset management in areas where we need it and are just getting to grips with it. OpenChain is the same. We have a draft AI system bill of materials compliance guide for the supply chain. The difference to having, let's say, like the SPDX thing is dealing with a format. We're dealing with the process management of how would you deal with AI compliance in the supply chain. And you can find out more at this QR code. We just had a board meeting, and the board has approved that this guide goes into a public comment period. So there'll be a 6-week period, and after that, I guess, we'll move into the formal release phase and make it an official asset. And this guide is going to allow people to structure their process approach to dealing with this form of compliance. Hey, Faye, how you doing? We're also dealing more and more with the SBOM quality. I mentioned the telco stuff because we had amazing metrics. We talked to people. We did a survey and said, what are you concerned about with compliance? And 34.2% of people, and that was the majority choosing one thing, said that they were concerned with SBOM quality. So we've been working on a cross-industry guide proposal for helping people deal with that, and especially they're cooking up having lots of samples of showing you in JSON format what is it you would need for executive order and CRA if you're using SPDX or if you're using Cyclone. Example, example, example. This is what you need to ask your suppliers for. Right. The conclusion point is taking us to the key issue. The market is pretty clearly moving in one direction. Open source is getting more professional, accountable, and sustainable. And this means it's getting much, much closer to traditional software asset management. That is not a surprise. The question, I suppose, outstanding is how do we manage that convergence elegantly? What is it that we need to do to make sure that open source lands neatly into this inevitable convergence? And going right back to the beginning of my presentation where I showed the early enterprise days of Linux with Linus and Dirk, and then the later days of that when Dirk and Linus are more mature and older, that was all about the same thing. They landed it. They took open source from the very early days through to massive market adoption, and then they landed it into being the majority of software. Now, we have to do something similar on the management side. OpenChain Project will be part of that. We're particularly focused on a few areas. You know, the supply chain as a whole is of interest to us, but we tend to spend the most time thinking about things like procurement, M&A, and the management side of supply chain. So we're planning to continue building out resources there in that specific series of spaces to assist companies as we see the convergence with traditional software asset management. And we will also continue to address new things like AI and software SBOM quality. And I wanted really to make the point that if you're dealing with the transition period, remember that OpenChain is explicitly here to help. You know, as companies evolve with this, we're here to support them and evolve with them. And that includes thinking about what is it that you might need. Now, part of it is that, for instance, we publish a ton of processes showing how we do things. Some of the processes are relevant to building a standard. Some of the processes are relevant to how you work with other people in study groups or work groups. But over time, you'll see more and more processes exposed, and those processes will include more and more information and links to how your company deals with the topic of convergence with software asset management. And an important point, and this is where maybe the community comes into play, and it can be communicated into your companies, into your software asset management teams, is that OpenChain is here to help when new things are needed. So when people are looking at the convergence and thinking, I can't find a resource for this, do I have to write one? Do I have to work this out on my own? The answer is, No, you don't. We're here to explicitly do it. Reference material, guides, checklists, we're willing to work on this and work with you on building this. And I think that's an important message to take out there, because people often start doing something on their own. And if 10 people need it, 10 people are doing it on their own, that's not as efficient as if we have a phone call and work on it together. So pulling back, the point is that we are going to see software asset management become how we deal with open source. Open source is getting much less confusing, period, because we have the maturity in the market to address it. Open source is inevitably increasingly aligning with traditional approaches to management, because we don't want two ways of dealing with the same thing. Software is software. And we have a space to work on that. OpenChain has always prided itself on being a sort of grand central station. We're very high level, and we deal with a lot of people incoming, just starting with open source compliance, just starting with managing the supply chain. And we're very happy to catch people with the fundamental question of what on earth is this, and then guide them with our material, but also to other projects and communities to fill out the gaps. Just today, we had a wonderful input from Chris Wood, the chair of SPEC. And I think it was really useful. Chris was talking about the way that new domains and concerns are appearing for open source. And he was talking about the way that we must not get distracted by thinking everything is separate, that everything needs to be addressed in a different manner. That we should instead look holistically at the field and think, how do we find the most commonalities and address things in the same way? And that's sort of the approach we've always taken and we will continue to take. And in this transition period, I hope we can contribute positively to it. Wrapping up, before I say, let's talk more, I wanted to give credit to companies in our ecosystem, including, for instance, partner companies that do commercial services that have done a big lift on taking us towards software asset management. I pointed out Russ from OSS Consultants in the BlackBerry case study, one contribution. The maturity modeling I just showed you a few minutes ago, that's originated from Orcro in the UK, another massive contribution. We've seen a lot of help from companies like PwC and Deloitte. I think it's worth just pointing out then that, you know, we have this tremendous amount of people coming together and working on this. And I'm feeling very positive about where we'll go. But I don't want to underplay that there will be rough edges and challenges. If there's one thing that's absolutely true of how the development of open source went, you know, looking again at people like Dirk, looking at Linus, they went so far and did so much, it's easy to forget how difficult that is to do for decades and all the distractions, diversions, all of that, and to go through it. Our convergence with software asset management is inevitable, but it won't be totally smooth. We're going to have to do some work to make sure that it operates effectively. In my concern, so the supply chain can access that, even the smallest company can do that. In your concern, to make sure that your organization will have as little friction as possible, and as the teams are required to work together, they can communicate in the same language, which originally was a challenge for us with license compliance and security. Those two teams and companies didn't speak the same language at all. That's changing. We've worked on it. Now we work on this. Alrighty, thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. You're meant to clap. Alrighty. If there's any questions, I'll do it. If not, it's coffee time. All right, and we're still recording, so the last thing I want to do is give a huge shout out to Frank at Ericsson, because we're in Denver, Colorado right now, and I live in Japan. I'm a resident. Frank just came from Ireland. I'm Irish. He brought me Irish chocolate and potato chips and stuff as a special treat that I'm taking back to Japan. So huge kudos to Frank. And with that, I end.